Panzer crews attempting to coordinate with their accompanying infantry found the narrow HF bands abruptly crowded by static pulses that rose and fell with unnatural regularity. A tank commander later recalled that every time he tried to raise his supporting platoon, another voice cut across ours, as if someone else knew our schedule. Confusion spread quickly. Several units reverted to colored flags or dispatched messengers on foot, losing precious minutes as American anti-tank guns and artillery tightened their fields of fire. Captured German staff officers would later describe their radios as infected, a term that captured the unsettling sense that an unseen presence had entered the network with malicious precision, though still experimental. The success at El Qatar proved that deception-based jamming could fracture German operational tempo at exactly the moment counterattacks required speed and coherence. The effectiveness of masking transmitters behind ridgelines encouraged Allied planners to refine the method for the mountainous fronts awaiting them in Sicily and mainland Italy, where terrain would offer even better concealment for the growing arsenal of mobile decoy units. By July 1943, as the fighting in Sicily intensified and German formations scrambled to contain the Allied landings, a new pattern of radio failures began to appear with unsettling regularity. Companies of the Hermann Goering Division reported that their normally disciplined nets were being disrupted by intrusions that sounded unmistakably like fellow German operators. These voices carried the familiar tone, pacing, and clipped phrasing of trained signals men. Yet their messages made no tactical sense orders to divert to non-existent positions, instructions to halt during active engagements, or sudden commands to withdraw that clashed with standing directives. Near Caltanissetta, operators described the uncanny sensation of hearing what seemed to be their own headquarters. Voice patterns transmitted with slight, almost imperceptible distortions. At first, unit staff suspected captured transmitters or rogue long-range patrols acting independently, but quick checks revealed no missing equipment and no sign of unauthorized German transmissions. Within range, the confusion deepened during the early stages of the Italian mainland campaign, where elements of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division encountered bursts of static that struck precisely as units attempted to regroup after Allied bombardments. Forced to rotate frequencies again and again, German operators found themselves stepping through their entire daily schedule in minutes, only to discover each channel collapsing behind them as if an unseen force were anticipating every move. Senior Wehrmacht signals analysts, reviewing field logs, became alarmed when they realized the interference tracked German procedure, with near-perfect accuracy mimicking call signs, matching shift timings, and slipping into frequencies listed solely in encrypted daily orders. By autumn, the Abwehr concluded that the Allies not only understood German radio routines, but possessed equipment capable of counterfeiting them with surgical precision. The psychological effect spread quickly. Operators hesitated before acknowledging new instructions. Commanders reverted to runners and colored panels, and the once fluid German communication system grew sluggish at critical moments. This emerging distrust within the Wehrmacht's radio network created vulnerabilities that Allied planners were eager to exploit, setting the stage for the industrial-scale preparation that would define operations in 1944. By the opening months of 1944, the experimental equipment first tested in the desert had evolved into a standardized instrument of electronic deception. Allied command recognized that sporadic battlefield use would no longer suffice, and new directives called for the mass production of decoy transmitters, capable of operating across the full range of German tactical frequencies. Specialized workshops in Britain, particularly those attached to the wireless experimental establishment, began assembling compact sets fitted with interchangeable frequency crystals and adjustable modulation controls. Each unit was designed with concealment in mind. Collapsible aerials allowed the transmitter to be mounted on jeeps or half-tracks without drawing attention, while ruggedized American-built chassis ensured the devices could survive jolting rides across muddy fields or shattered roads. To meet demand, American factories turned out reinforced casings and heat-resistant components, while British engineers supplied the finely tuned oscillators required to imitate the subtle tonal signatures German operators instinctively recognized. Parallel to this industrial push, Allied logistics officers organized dedicated deception companies within both the U.S. and British signal corps. These units maintained trucks stocked with spare coils, batteries, and captured German procedure sheets, and their operators trained alongside frontline divisions. Many became adept at reading German traffic patterns in real time, learning to anticipate when a battalion would shift to a reserve frequency, or when a panzer regiment would open a new net to coordinate a counterattack. By the spring of 1944, nearly every major Allied army group possessed mobile decoy transmitters ready for deployment. What had begun as a clever laboratory experiment had grown into a dispersed network of specialist machines, and vehicles capable of shaping the tactical soundscape of the battlefield. As preparations intensified for the Normandy landings, commanders understood that controlling the enemy's communication rhythms could determine the tempo of the campaign that followed, setting the stage for the Decoy transmitter's decisive role in France. Dawn light filtered unevenly through the Normandy hedgerows in the days after the 6th of June 1944, creating a maze of shadows where Allied deception teams quietly unpacked their newest transmitters. Hidden behind earthen banks, orchard walls, and thickets of oak and hawthorn, these small units began shaping the battlefield in ways the Germans could not yet detect. The landings at Omaha, Utah, and Gold had shattered the coastal command rhythm, and airborne drops had scattered German expectations across dozens of false alarms. Into this confusion, Allied operators slipped their broadcast with deliberate precision, choosing moments when German staffs already strained by contradictory reports attempted to re-establish contact between isolated strongpoints and higher headquarters. The effect became undeniable by the 10th of June. Elements of the 352 Infantry Division regrouping near Isigny found their regimental nets flickering with overlapping commands that used familiar German phrasing yet failed to match any known call signs. Officers attempting to prepare a counterattack received sudden bursts of traffic, suggesting orders to reposition flanking companies, only to discover minutes later that no such directives had been issued. The dense hedgerow terrain amplified the illusion, causing the interference to feel local, as if originating from a friendly unit hidden just beyond the next bank. By the 15th of June, while U.S. the 7th Corps pushed south toward Carentan, German Panzer Grenadiers reported ghost orders redirecting platoons toward non-existent assembly points. The more they attempted to clarify instructions through frequency changes, the more the Allied transmitters mirrored their movements, collapsing each new channel almost as soon as it opened. This creeping paralysis slowed German reaction times across the Cotentin Peninsula. Counteroffensives launched without synchronized armor-infantry coordination faltered in the narrow lanes, and after-action reports from German headquarters repeatedly cited radio breakdowns as a central cause of delayed maneuvers. With each disrupted net, Allied planners gained confidence that their invisible weapon could unbalance even well-organized divisions. These early successes in Normandy encouraged signals officers to prepare far more aggressive deployments for the German counterstroke they believed was inevitable preparations that would culminate in the decisive communications collapse at Morton in August. By the height of the Normandy campaign in the summer of 1944, the damage inflicted by Decoy radio transmitters had expanded beyond tangled frequencies and failed counterattacks. It had begun to hollow out the psychological foundations of German frontline communications. For years, Wehrmacht operators had relied on the precision of their wireless nets as confidently as they relied on their rifles. A clear transmission from battalion or regiment was the thread that held dispersed units together in the chaos of battle. Now the thread frayed with every distorted message. In dugouts around Caen, in slit trenches near Saint-La, and in the cramped command posts carved into farmhouses or hedgerow banks, operators hesitated before acknowledging new instructions, wondering whether the clipped phrasing came from their own headquarters or from the unseen intruder who had haunted their nets in Sicily. Veterans who had trusted their equipment through Poland and France found themselves double-checking call signs and challenging transmissions at moments when seconds mattered. Some whispered about phantom voices that imitated their staff officers too closely, while others spoke of unseen operators capable of slipping into even the most disciplined battalion nets. The resulting hesitation forced commanders to shift back to runners, colored panels, and prearranged signals methods slower, less flexible, and far more vulnerable under Allied fire. Morale reports from divisions such as the 84 Infantry Division noted growing anxiety among signals personnel, who feared that any message received during or after heavy fighting might have been corrupted. Each doubtful glance at a radio handset chipped away at the confidence required for German combined arms coordination, particularly as tanks, infantry, and artillery increasingly moved without the synchronized rhythm that had once defined blitzkrieg. Meanwhile, Allied troops gained quiet reassurance from the knowledge that they could disrupt enemy command structures without revealing their own positions, widening the psychological gulf between attacker and defender. As the summer wore on and German formations attempted larger maneuvers to stabilize their disintegrating front, the creeping doubt seeded by those ghost voices became a decisive liability one that set the stage for the catastrophic collapse of communication. During the major operations of late August 1944, by late July 1944, the small cracks opened by Decoy radio interference had grown into systemic fractures across the German defensive network in Normandy. When the U.S. First Army launched Operation Cobra on the 25th of July, The Wehrmacht's ability to coordinate its countermeasures depended on fast, clear wireless communication among the two Panzer 275 Infanterie and 353 Infanterie divisions positioned south of Saint-Lô. Yet as American bombers pounded the front and armored spearheads surged into the breaches, German command posts discovered that their tactical nets were already thick, with the familiar disruptive pulses that had plagued them since June. Officers attempting to shift reserves found their orders delayed, duplicated, or drowned beneath narrow band interference that forced them to rotate frequencies again and again. What should have been tightly managed counterattacks emerged instead as disjointed movements, with battalions advancing minutes or even hours apart fatal gaps when American air and artillery waited to isolate each thrust. The consequences multiplied during the decisive counterstroke at Morton on the 7th of August. Panzer grenadiers and tank crews tasked with driving toward Avranches an effort intended to sever the American advance and stabilize the collapsing front tendered the assault, already hampered by incomplete or contradictory orders. Some camped up in advance before their neighboring units even received the signal to move. Others halted in confusion after hearing overlapping messages that resembled official commands, but lacked proper authentication. As U.S. divisions exploited these fractures, the German drive toward Avranches lost its coherence and momentum, dissolving into isolated attacks easily contained by American defensive fire and relentless airstrikes. The unraveling of wireless cohesion not only doomed the Morton attack, but also contributed to the widening encirclement that would culminate around Falaise, where broken communications left entire formations unaware of when or where to retreat. These setbacks revealed a stark strategic truth. Without reliable radios, German defenses could no longer function as a unified system. The collapse of coherent wireless control accelerated the disintegration of the entire Normandy front, leaving commanders increasingly reactive as Allied forces pressed eastward. With each advance, the need to refine Decoy radio tactics for new terrain and faster-moving operations grew more urgent, paving the way for further innovation in the months that followed. The rapid Allied advance after the Normandy breakout exposed the first real constraints on a tactic that had thrived in dense hedgerows and broken bocage. By late August 1944, the fighting had shifted into the more open country of Belgium and the Netherlands, where rolling fields, long sight lines, and scattered villages offered fewer natural positions in which small Decoy transmitters could be concealed. Deception teams that had once hidden easily behind banks and orchards now found themselves relying on the cover of moving columns or the shallow folds of terrain, making timing and placement more delicate. At the same time, German signals intelligence, battered but still persistent, began experimenting with direction-finding sets in an effort to trace the unauthorized voices that had undermined their operations throughout the summer. In theory, these methods could pinpoint the source of interference. In practice, the chaos of retreat, intermittent power supply, and the sheer speed of Allied advances prevented sustained tracking. German adaptations introduced further complications, as the Wehrmacht shifted increasingly to emergency frequencies and attempted to revive wire communications wherever possible. The narrow-band precision of earlier Allied Decoy work had to evolve. Deception teams broadened their frequency coverage, cycling quickly across wider segments of the tactical spectrum to follow German improvisation. Mobile transmitters were mounted on armored reconnaissance vehicles or fast-moving support trucks, enabling operators to maintain pressure on German nets even as Frontline shifted by several kilometers in a day. These efforts kept the tactic relevant during the pursuit toward the Siegfried Line. In September 1944, though by then Germany's command structure had fractured to the point that fewer high-level nets remained intact enough to manipulate, the shifting nature of the battlefield revealed both the resilience and the limits of the method. The Decoy transmitters remained potent tools, but they depended increasingly on speed, adaptability, and close integration with advancing armies rather than static concealment. These constraints foreshadowed the next stage of their wartime use and pointed toward the broader doctrines of electronic warfare that would emerge after 1945. Dawn on the 7th of August 1944 bled into the low valleys south of Morton as a pale, colorless light seeped over the bocage and the orchards still dripping from the night's rain. In the half-light, German infantrymen of the 2 SS Panzer Division Das Reich crouched beside hedgerow roots, while armored engines idled unseen behind the slopes, their breath turning to faint mist in the cool morning air. Operation Luttich was supposed to resume with coordinated thrusts toward Avranches, and many believed that the early hour before American fighter bombers filled the sky was their narrow window to regain the initiative. Yet even before the first panzers rolled forward, the attack felt wrong. Inside company foxholes and forward command post, Operators hunched over torn.fu, D2, and feldfu.b-sets twisted their dials with growing frustration, as only rasping bursts of static greeted them. Then pulses slid across the frequencies like metallic whispers, sometimes resolving into clipped, meaningless German phrases that made seasoned signals men stiffen. A veteran radio operator later recalled the sensation, as if someone else was finishing our sentences before we spoke them. By 05:00 hours, runners arrived with reports that entire battalion nets were failing simultaneously. Panzer grenadiers moving along sunken lanes could not raise their supporting armor. Platoons emerging from the mist discovered their own company headquarters unreachable. The soundscape of the battlefield, normally a layered mix of coded chatter, map updates, and range corrections, had dissolved into a hollow quiet broken only by distant American guns. Officers first suspected faulty batteries or waterlogged connectors, but the pattern of interference was too precise. It struck only the frequencies assigned for that morning's push, skipping over reserved channels that had been used the previous day. Some commanders whispered that the Americans must have intercepted their plans, though few could explain how the enemy could predict channel changes that had been finalized only hours earlier. As the early sun burned weakly through the fog, couriers were dispatched to restore the collapsing command structure, galloping between hedgerows with handwritten orders that were already outdated by the time they arrived. At divisional headquarters, reports accumulated of panzer columns halted not by enemy fire, but by uncertainty. Without radio coordination, units that depended on synchronized breakthroughs were advancing unevenly, exposing flanks and leaving infantry isolated in the maze of fields. Too many on the ground, the silence felt engineered rather than accidental, an unseen hand reaching into their networks and bending them out of shape. Only later would survivors learn that mobile Allied transmitters positioned behind American lines had begun feeding false signals and overwhelming German frequencies, creating an invisible barrier through which no coherent message could pass. The confusion that settled over Morton that morning was more than a temporary disruption. It signaled the arrival of a new dimension of warfare, in which radio waves themselves became weapons. The eerie collapse of Germany's communication net on the 7th of August marked the threshold, where technical improvisation, intelligence work, and deception merged into a single strategy. Understanding how that moment came to be requires stepping back into the earlier years of the war, when German confidence in wireless coordination shaped entire campaigns and created the vulnerabilities the Allies would soon exploit. The story of Morton's chaos cannot be understood without returning to the war's early years, when Germany first demonstrated how a modern army could fight through the airwaves as effectively as it fought on the ground. In September 1939, during the invasion of Poland, German commanders discovered that even small mechanized groups could maneuver with striking independence as long as their radios stayed alive. By the spring of 1940, across the plains of France and the Low Countries, the combination of fast armor thrust and dense wireless coordination produced an operational rhythm that stunned Allied staffs. British and French formations, still dependent on field telephones or runners for detailed control, struggled to react to panzer divisions that could redirect entire columns with a few short transmissions. What astonished observers at the time was not merely the technical advantage, but the discipline. German tank crews changed frequencies according to daily schedules. Artillery observers passed grid references with clipped efficiency, and battalion commanders expected their torn.fu, D2, and torn.fu.g radios to function even while shells burst overhead. By the campaigns in the Balkans in 1941, the system of mobile, radiocentric warfare had become a defining feature of the Wehrmacht's confidence. Yet, the same strengths revealed deeper vulnerabilities as the front expanded eastward into the Soviet Union. Allied intelligence officers studying the early Barbarossa battles noticed that when German units lost signal clarity, even momentarily, local staff struggled to reassemble. The flow of orders that kept fast maneuver alive. A single blocked frequency could slow a regiment. A misaligned antenna could halt an advance entirely. British and American cryptanalysts examining captured sets and procedure logs realized that the very structure of German radio discipline created predictable patterns. Channels rotated at known intervals. Call signs followed regular formats, and units adhered rigidly to protocol even under stress. This predictability, once admired, offered a roadmap for future exploitation. The problem was that existing jamming methods were too blunt. Broad-spectrum interference risked crippling Allied radios as much as German ones, and heavy stationary transmitters could not operate safely near front lines without revealing their position. What planners needed was a weapon that behaved less like a wall of noise and more like an impersonator, something that could slip into the narrow band. Frequencies used by German tactical nets imitate their cadence and unravel their coordination without announcing itself. The search for such a tool pushed Allied intelligence into a new realm, where deception mattered as much as raw power, laying the foundation for mobile transmitters that could mimic German signals convincingly enough to cause momentary hesitation or catastrophic confusion. As this challenge grew sharper through 1942 and 1943, the stage was set for a dramatic shift in how radio warfare would be fought, a development that leads directly into the birth of the first Decoy transmitters designed to infiltrate the Wehrmacht's ether with precision. TRIALS in the autumn of 1942 marked the moment when radio warfare shifted from broad, clumsy interference to a far more surgical deception tool. In dim prefabricated huts at the wireless experimental establishment in southern England, British technicians hunched over benches scattered with captured German tuning coils, cracked frequency crystals, and the gutted chassis of torn fusets taken from North Africa and the Channel coast. Their goal was no longer simply to drown out enemy messages. It was to enter the German nets themselves to sound so convincingly like a FUG-5 or torn food transmitter that frontline operators would not realize an imposter had joined their circuit. Across the Atlantic, American Signal Corps engineers pursued the same idea, stripping down components until they produced compact transmitters no larger than a suitcase, light enough to mount in a Jeep or hide in the back of an armored command car. The breakthrough came when both teams learned to replicate not just German frequencies but the subtle signatures that trained operators instinctively recognized: the slight audio roughness of a well-used FUG-5, the modulation patterns of a torn .fu.d2, the rhythm of short command bursts used by battalion staffs. With this mimicry in place, designers added rotating frequency wheels that cycled through predictable German daily schedules, allowing the decoy sets to anticipate channel changes before they occurred. In tests, technicians discovered they could insert false instructions that compelled German units to switch repeatedly, fracturing their coordination and pushing commanders toward overworked runners and couriers. Suddenly, these transmitters were no longer mere jammers but mobile saboteurs of enemy communication, small enough to travel with advancing armor or to hide in hillside brush overlooking a battlefield. As confidence grew, planners searched for a front where the technology could meet real combat, an opportunity that pointed toward the desert fighting of North Africa. Dawn, on the 23rd of March 1943, lifted over the stony ridgelines east of El Guitar as a pale desert wind scraped along the Wadis where the German 10 Panzer Division assembled after a night of probing artillery duels. The first light revealed dust hanging above the valley floor, and the silhouettes of panzers edging forward in tactical groups, their antenna whips trembling with each engine vibration. German officers expected to re-establish momentum after the initial exchanges with U.S. II Corps, relying as always on the disciplined flow of radio traffic that allowed dispersed Kampfgruppen to synchronize movement across broken ground. Instead, the moment their signals officers began transmitting, a strange interference crept into the nets. What should have been crisp battalion updates arrived muddled with overlapping command tones, eerily similar to those of their own division headquarters. Seconds later, new bursts appeared, issuing what sounded like orders to shift flanks or halt entirely, each one matching the cadence of familiar operators yet contradicting the previous instruction.